Frank Wilder had long since made peace with solitude. A man in his early 50s, he had spent most of his adult life behind the wheel of an old freightliner, hauling cargo across the snow-covered roads of Montana. His home, a creaky wooden cabin tucked away at the edge of the pine forest, was modest but sturdy, just like him. Life hadn't always been easy, but Frank wasn't the type to complain. He preferred things simple: black coffee, long drives, and the quiet hum of the radio crackling out old country tunes. Though he kept to himself, those who had crossed his path often remembered him. He had a habit of stopping for strangers, changing tires in the rain, or sharing his thermos with someone cold and lost at a rest stop. He never expected anything in return. "People don't need to know your name to remember your kindness," he often told himself, a quiet mantra that kept him grounded through the years. In a world rushing past him, Frank moved at his own pace, slow, steady, and kind. He had no idea that one snowy night, a simple act of decency would bring the world rushing right to his front door. The snow was coming down hard that night, blanketing the narrow mountain road in thick, blinding white. Frank gripped the steering wheel with both hands, his headlights slicing through the storm like a dull blade. It was late, and all he wanted was to get home, kick off his boots, and warm his bones by the wood stove. But as he rounded a bend near Dead Man's Pass, a flicker of hazard lights blinked weakly in the swirling snow. At first, he hesitated. It had been a long day, and pulling over in a storm wasn't the smartest move. But then he saw her, a girl maybe 18, pacing beside a stalled sedan. She wore a thin hoodie, her arms wrapped tight around her shivering frame, her hair stuck to her face with freezing sleet. Frank's heart caught. For a split second, she reminded him of someone, his little sister Ellie, who died on a night not so different from this one. Without a word, Frank pulled over, flicked on his hazards, and stepped into the storm. It took 15 minutes to jump her battery, get the engine sputtering back to life. He offered her his thermos, then drove behind her until they reached a gas station. She was still shaking when he handed her his cell phone to call her parents. "Thank you," she said, eyes glistening. Frank gave a tired smile. "One day," he said gently, "help someone else like I helped you." She nodded through her tears. Her name was Maya. Frank watched her drive away, the snow swallowing her taillights. Then he climbed back into his truck, never imagining that this small moment would echo far beyond the storm. By the time Frank made it home, the storm had eased into a soft flurry. He parked his truck beside the cabin, its tires crunching over the packed snow, and trudged inside. The fire had long gone out, so he tossed in a few logs and struck a match, warming his hands while the flames crackled back to life. He didn't think much about the girl. Not because he didn't care, he did, but because, to him, helping her had felt as natural as breathing. The next morning, he was back behind the wheel before dawn. Another delivery run. Another long stretch of highway cutting through frostbitten hills and empty fields. The days blurred together, hauling pallets, chatting briefly with gas station clerks, tightening bolts, checking tire pressure. The rhythm of Frank's life was predictable, almost meditative. Wake up, drive, fix what's broken, eat alone, sleep. His only real company came from the occasional deer in the yard, the crackle of AM radio, and a worn photo of Ellie on the mantel, her smile frozen in time, forever 17. He never told anyone about Maya. Not because it was a secret, but because it didn't seem like a story worth sharing. People got stranded. People got helped. That's just how it ought to be. Frank never expected thanks. He wasn't waiting for a call or a miracle. Life had taught him not to expect much. What mattered was doing the right thing in the moment, then moving on. He figured Maya was home by now, warm and safe with her family. That was enough. So Frank kept moving, down familiar roads, past bare trees and frozen rivers, never knowing that the kindness he'd given so freely was already on its way back to him. It was 3 days later, just after sunrise, when Frank heard the crunch of tires on the gravel drive. He looked up from his coffee, still steaming in a chipped mug, and squinted out the frosted window. At first, He thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. Parked neatly in front of his weathered cabin was a white limousine, sleek, spotless, and wildly out of place against the backdrop of pine trees and snow-covered ground. He stepped outside, flannel shirt open over his long johns, boots half-laced. The cold bit at his skin, but curiosity burned stronger. Two figures stepped out of the limo, both dressed in sharp black coats, polished shoes sinking slightly into the snow. "Mr. Frank Wilder?" the taller one asked, offering a polite nod. Frank hesitated. "Yeah, that's me. We've been sent by someone you helped recently." "A young woman named Maya," the other man said, his tone calm but formal. Frank blinked. The name stirred something in him. The snow. The stranded car. The girl with tears in her eyes. "She'd like to see you," the first man continued. "She's extended a personal invitation. It's important." Frank frowned, glancing from the limo to the horizon. Part of him wanted to laugh it off. This had to be some mix-up. But another part, the part that never ignored a gut feeling, told him this was no prank. He drained the rest of his coffee, set the mug down on the porch railing, and nodded. "All right," he said slowly. "Let me grab my coat." As the limo doors swung open and he slid into the leather seat, Frank couldn't help but feel like the quiet life he'd always known was about to take a turn he never saw coming. The limousine wound its way up a long tree-lined drive that opened onto a sprawling estate nestled atop a wooded hill. The snow had been cleared from the path, revealing cobblestone walkways and manicured hedges dusted in white. Frank had never seen anything like it, not in person anyway. The main building looked like something out of an old university brochure, towering brick, tall windows, and banners fluttering in the wind bearing a name he didn't recognize. They called it the Anderton International Academy. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of cedar and old books. Frank was led through polished marble halls, past students in uniforms, and into a grand auditorium filled with gold-trimmed chairs and velvet curtains. At the front, standing beside a podium, was Maya. But she wasn't the same frightened girl from the roadside. She wore a navy blue blazer, her posture graceful and assured, her expression calm but bright. When she saw Frank, she smiled warmly and stepped forward. "Frank," she said, "I'm so glad you came." He stared at her, trying to piece everything together. "I should have told you more that night," she continued. "I'm the daughter of Michael Anderton. He built this school, and more. But the truth is, I've built something too." She gestured to a banner hanging overhead, Kind Chain Foundation. "I founded this non-profit to recognize and amplify everyday acts of kindness. I want to find people who give without expecting anything in return. People like you." Frank stood still, hands in his pockets, stunned. "You were the first," Maya said. "The first person who reminded me why this mission matters. That even in a snowstorm, someone will stop, just to help." After the applause faded and the room began to empty, Maya led Frank into a quiet study lined with bookshelves and soft lighting. A fire crackled gently in the hearth, and on a nearby table sat a large envelope and a set of keys resting atop a small wooden box. "I wanted to thank you properly," Maya said, motioning toward the table. "What you did for me that night, it changed more than you know." Frank looked at the items, then back at her, eyebrows drawn in confusion. She picked up the envelope and placed it in his hand. "This check covers more than just your time. It's enough to pay off whatever debts you carry. And if you still dream of buying back that land your family lost years ago, now you can." Frank's throat tightened. He hadn't mentioned that land to anyone in years. Maya smiled knowingly, then held up the keys. "And this?" "A brand new rig, fully equipped, top of the line. Yours." He stared at them in silence, overwhelmed. "But there's one more thing," she added. "I want you to join the Kind Chain Foundation, not just as a name on a list, but as a voice. I want you to speak, to share your story. People listen to stories like yours." Frank shook his head slowly, voice low. Why me? Maya stepped closer, her tone gentle but unwavering. Because you didn't need a reason to be kind. You didn't know who I was. You didn't ask for anything. That's the kind of goodness the world needs to see. For the first time in a long while, Frank felt the weight of his quiet life shift, lightened by something he couldn't quite name. Back at the cabin, everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same. Frank sat on the creaky wooden rocker out on the porch, a blanket draped over his shoulders and a chipped mug of coffee cradled in his hands. The snow was falling again, soft and steady, blanketing the trees and fence posts in silence. He stared out at the woods, his breath curling into the cold air, and let the quiet settle over him. The envelope still lay unopened on the kitchen table behind him, the keys beside it. He hadn't touched them since returning. His thoughts wandered, not to Maya or the limousine, but to a past he rarely visited. His father had died when Frank was just 12, leaving behind a truck and a toolbox. His mother worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table, her hands rough and voice soft. Frank joined the army at 17, then came home to raise his little sister after their mother passed. He drove trucks because it paid steady, and because it was lonely enough to match the way he felt inside after Ellie died in a wreck she never should have been in. He had lived a quiet life. A good one, maybe. But not one he ever thought would matter to anyone beyond the gas stations and freight depots where his name was barely remembered. Now someone had seen something in him. Offered him a way to do more. Be more. He rocked slowly, listening to the wind in the trees. Then he stood, walked inside, and picked up the phone. The line rang once. Twice. Then Maya answered. "It's Frank," he said. "I'm in." 2 mornings later, the white limousine returned, tires crunching softly over the gravel. But this time, Frank didn't hesitate. He stepped out onto the porch in a clean flannel and polished boots, a small duffel over his shoulder, and eyes that held something new purpose. As the driver opened the door, Frank took one last look at the woods he called home, then climbed in with a quiet nod. His journey wasn't ending. It was just beginning. 1 year later, Frank stood on a brightly lit stage in front of hundreds of teenagers seated in rows across a spacious auditorium. The banners read Kindness Week, and the Kind Chain Foundation logo hung behind him, glowing softly. He adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat, and took a moment to steady his hands. He had spoken before, in diners, to gas station clerks, to old friends on bar stools, but never like this. Never to an audience filled with young faces hungry for meaning. He told them about the snowstorm. About the girl in the hoodie with tear-filled eyes. About how he'd almost driven past her that night. About Ellie. About his cabin in the woods and the long, quiet life he'd lived without ever expecting recognition. He didn't dramatize it. He didn't need to. He just told the truth. The kind of truth that sits heavy in your chest and reminds you of what really matters. Local news cameras captured the moment. Frank, in his worn boots and simple flannel, didn't look like someone used to the spotlight. But the room hung on his every word. And when he reached the end, he looked out over the sea of faces and said quietly, but clearly, "Kindness doesn't need a camera. But sometimes, it does need a witness. Be that witness." The room was still for a heartbeat, and then the applause rose, loud, long, and full of something deeper than noise. Frank smiled, not for himself, but for all the small acts of good that had ever gone unnoticed. Sometimes, the most ordinary moments leave the deepest marks. Frank Wilder never planned to change a life. He didn't do anything dramatic, just stopped to help a young woman stranded in the snow. No cameras. No witnesses. Just quiet decency. But kindness has a way of echoing. This story reminds us that every small choice matters. A helping hand, a gentle word, a moment of compassion. These things may seem invisible in the moment, but they can ripple through time in ways we'll never fully understand. In a world that often feels rushed and divided, it's easy to believe that simple goodness goes unnoticed. But it doesn't. Sometimes, the smallest gestures speak the loudest truths, especially to those who need them most. To those of us in our later years, Frank's journey is a gentle reminder: it's never too late to make a difference, and sometimes, the life you change might be your own. So be kind. Not for recognition, not for reward, but because it's right. Because one act of grace, however small, might be the spark that lights someone else's path home. If this story warmed your heart, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD for more real-life inspired stories that remind us of the goodness still alive in this world. Every click, every share, helps us continue telling stories that matter. Stories that heal, uplift, and inspire. Your support keeps kindness alive, one story at a time.